Well, greetings, everyone. David Arundel here. I'm sharing with you a recording of a webinar that I conducted back in 2021 for a group of European educators. They wanted to talk about how to be able to use podcasting and some other technologies for professional development. Something in particular I want to draw your attention to on this very first slide is this website here. I won't go and read it here. What I recommend is that you go and pause and write down this web address, because I have an enormous amount of podcasting resources that I made available, placed all of these onto a web page, and I'm going to keep that web page up. So I'll be moving pretty quickly through this recording. I'll not be reading all the words on slides, and I'm going to trust that you're going to go and dive deeper into the subject of podcasting by taking a look at this webpage here. I'll also have the same webpage address on the very final slide of my presentation. So let's go ahead and get started. Important to start off with some thank yous and some acknowledgments. You see circled there in the middle a couple of my former students from my global history class. We started podcasting in 2005, and we did it as a supplement to our global history course. I learned from them. They taught me how to be able to do podcasting, particularly Eric. He actually set up a computer in a classroom on Saturday mornings for about a month, and he trained both Brian and myself how to be able to think about podcasting, how to be able to conceptualize the programs, and how actually to be able to edit the files. Eric actually ended up being the editor the editor for the podcast for the first year, and then I took over later. You see lots of other individuals and organizations which also were involved in training me how to be able to do podcasting. So to them, I'm greatly indebted. What's our agenda? Well, it's a pretty aggressive one, as you can see. And as I said, I'm not going to be reading all the words, but at least scan through the list. These are the things which I'm going to touch on. But in order to really dive deeper, you really are going to need to go to that website I mentioned before. Well, first of all, what's a podcast? Well, probably the most important of all the definitions is this one here, which is it gives you the ability to listen when and where that you want to. It gives you this maximum flexibility. It comes on a regular basis. It could be a weekly basis, or it could be every 2 weeks, at least every month it comes out. And that's kind of some key things that go into what goes into a podcast. They're also free for the most part. There's over 5 million different podcasts available online, both for Android systems and iOS systems. So there's lots of opportunity to be able to listen. And my recommendation is just spend time listening to them. Another key element, I think, is that there are personal communication. Now, not all of them. Some of them are recorded news reports. Some of the most popular ones here in the United States, come from National Public Radio. So those are oftentimes scripted programs. Well, the independent ones that are made in people's basements just by themselves, well, it's about this personal conversation. And that's something I always recommend for people who are thinking about getting into podcasting, is don't think about it as someplace that you're going to make money like Joe Rogan here in the United States. I forget how many $1 million he makes each year. Good for him. Well, that's representing probably less than 0.1% of all the podcasters. Most podcasting is done for free because you think it's important to do. There's lots of other names that have been used for podcasting over time, so I'll just simply breeze through this slide here. And then the question is, how have you thought about using podcasting in your education program? I realize not everyone is an educator who's watching this on YouTube or through a web link, But the question is how could you think that you might be able to use podcasting or think of it as recorded voice with your peer learning program, with your class that you teach? And if not, how could you imagine maybe using something that looks like this? It's always good to have kind of an image in your mind and then think about as you're listening to the presentation whether if anything that makes sense. These are all the podcasts which I have either previously done or have currently done. This is actually the one on where it all started, then and now, and you can still find it. It's still rolling. After starting in 2005, I forget how many episodes that we're up to, and currently what we're doing is that we're rebroadcasting my history course. So if you're interested in global history, it's an easy way for you to be able to listen to a global history course of about the last 150 years or so. And then you can see other ones that are there as well. So once again, all of them are still available online except for the one down here for Paul Harvey. That one was taken offline because the Paul Harvey family is going to be coming out with their own podcast. And they actually have released a few episodes online. But all the rest of these are all available currently in case that you'd be interested in listening to them. What are the popular podcasts in the United States? Well, these are some of them that are really popular. I already talked about how National Public Radio probably has the most popular set of podcasts that are out there, and they have probably more than a dozen or so. Whenever I was preparing this a year ago, I also went to try to find out what kinds of podcasts were popular over in Europe. And according to the website I went to, these were part of the top 100 podcasts that were available. What are the topics that tend to be the most popular? Well, they tend to be news, and they tend to be crime, and they tend to be drama. And if you somehow can put together crime and drama together, that may be among the very, very top most popular podcasts that are out there. But once again, there's 5 million of those that are out there now. So there's a lot of different things that are popular. Why are they popular? Why are they? I already talked about the when and the where part. You control what is heard. It's the honesty of the podcasters. It's that relationship that I talked about a little bit earlier. Your audience needs to trust you, whatever it is that you're saying. You may have very controversial views. You may be very contrarian to what most people think. That's not the issue. The issue is, are you a consistent person with sharing your point of view? And with, 7 billion people on the earth, 3 billion smartphones that are out there, and frankly, that's the one that most people listen to podcasts through anymore now is through their smartphones. Well, you've got an enormous audience that are out there. As I said, actually, that number needs to be updated. Sorry about that. It's 5 million podcasts are available. The nice thing is that they're uncensored. Now, that doesn't give us license to say racist, harmful things. There's actually very little policing that is out there. It really is for you, for what kind of game rules do you want to follow? So in a sense, you're really being censored by yourself. That's the person who's in charge of the podcast. It's a relatively simple technology. I really kind of tried to figure out why were these independent podcasts so interesting and popular. And once again, think about it, podcasting started up in around about 2003 or so. The original ones were all these done by individuals. And in a sense, it was reality TV on audio. And also, that's another point, too, about podcasts. I'd say that probably 95% of them are all audio, and only about 5% are video. And why is that? Well, it's because of the file size. Videos take a lot of space, a lot to be transmitted out. And people out there in the real world, they're not going to want to download something that's 500 megabytes to their computer. It really very takes up a lot of space. Audio podcasts, on the other hand, while they don't tend to have large file sizes, many of them are probably going to be maybe 10 or maybe 20 megabytes at the most. But also the audio podcast, well, that works really well for people who are listening to it through their earbuds on their cell phones. So once again, just kind of think about whenever you're considering an audio podcast is probably a better place to start. We've already kind of covered the material inside of this slide here, so I'm going to go ahead and press forward. It's really good to have some sort of a listener feedback system in your podcast where you end up having an email address that people can send emails to, and also they can send audio files to. And for you as a podcaster, playing clips of those or reading some of the email messages that you receive, that really is helpful. That also makes the podcast a little bit more engaging for the listeners because they know that you're listening to the feedback that's coming to you, and some of that information is being fed back through you as a listener then. So something for you to consider. There's lots of different ways. My suggestion is to Google podcasting listener feedback, and you'll get into much deeper number of examples of how to be able to incorporate that. Just a few samples of the different kinds of categories of podcasts that are out there. Once again, thinking about what are you considering. There's a reason why you're watching this video. If you're this far in, you've already been listening for about 10 minutes, maybe 20 minutes or so. Obviously, you've got some sort of a purpose. So for many people, they tend to think about, well, how can I do something regarding my work? And what it was that would be useful to be able to have human voice on, and why would that be important? Some lessons and statistics. I'm going to breeze by these pretty quickly here. This is probably the biggest lesson that I hope that I can share with you that I've learned. Content is king. I used to think that a podcast had to be perfect. It had to have perfect editing. There wasn't any hesitations in the voice. You didn't hear someone repeat themselves or go or something like that. Now, it's nice to be able to edit some of that stuff out. But the reason why people are into podcasting is it's because of the content. You don't have to be perfect. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you already know this lesson because look at what YouTube has done for us. Well, they've taught us that authentic material created by individuals is watchable. And all the other social media, which is all flowed afterwards, TikToks and all the rest, they really all owe themselves a great debt to YouTube because what they taught us was you didn't have to be like a television production. You just simply needed to have a good voice that you could hear. You used a decent microphone. When I talk about a decent microphone, we'll talk about that later. We could be talking about something that maybe costs something like $50 or so. We're not talking about something that's very expensive, but it's important to have an important content, something that's compelling. The other thing that you can do with a podcast is not only can you send your voice or short video clips, you can also share PDF documents. It's kind of remarkable to know that you can be able to have supplemental material. Now, you got to be careful here about copyright. You can't violate that. I have one podcast that is sharing copyright-free audios of speeches of famous people. And what I do is that I end up going to Wikipedia and I end up selecting 2 or maybe 3 documents which supplement whatever that particular person is speaking. Maybe it's a biography of them. Maybe it's a record of some historical event that was really significant that they were involved with or something. Everything in Wikipedia is copyright free. That's the reason why they have Creative Commons license appears on all of the documents. So just something for you to consider. Not only share your voice, but also think about sharing handouts, curriculum, copyright-free material, and you got to be really careful about that. Things that are in the public domain and such. So something for you to consider. Statistics about U.S. downloads. Well, I think the most important thing to mention is it's mostly through mobile devices. It's through smartphones, and that's really where it's at. The same thing is also true for websites. They say that about 2/3 of all of the visits to a website occurs on a smartphone. And that's the reason why it's important for websites to be optimized for being able to read it on a much smaller screen on your smartphone. Not talking about on a tablet computer like an iPad or something. We're talking about it has to be legible enough on a smartphone because 2/3 in terms of mobile devices, 80% of all podcasts are listened to for the most part on smartphones. Actually, not a lot on slate computers then. Less on desktop computers. You still see Apple has a pretty dominant footprint in the market, but also Spotify now owns about 40% of the market on how people listen to podcasts. And we'll talk about Spotify a little bit later on. Spotify is a great place to start off with your podcast because it is free to host. It has some limitations, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on with comparing it with some paid services that are out there. And then once again, where do we see the growth occur? Well, you see faster growth occurring now among the Android devices, but still, iOS devices still own a great deal of the market. In terms of the state of podcasting, what percent of people are listening? If you look there in the very middle, in the tiny print, about 1/3 of Americans, according to the survey here, and I believe this was for 2018. I think things have changed a lot since the pandemic, and my guess is that a lot more social media has been watched now by a larger number of people who've been trapped at home during the pandemic. But at least in 2018, it was about 33% of people had listened. The people who are the biggest listeners were the South Koreans. And then those who were at the lower end were down here in the United Kingdom. But I think things have changed quite a bit over the pandemic. We'll see what the statistics are in the future. Now, in terms of where the Europeans are plugging in terms of the average for Europeans, it's about 28%. And once again, among the Europeans, it's highest up there in Spain with 40%. And then the lowest was 18% down here in the Netherlands. But like I said, I think these statistics probably will change quite a bit whenever they come out next time. Well, in terms of what is the average number of downloads or number of people who have listened to an episode? And I realize there's a lot of technical stuff about how do you justify whether or not people listen to the whole episode or they only listen to the first minute, or do they get downloaded to a computer and then never listen to it all? Well, as I understand the way that the statistics are now, the downloads, these are ones that actually have been opened. That's what I understand. So in terms of, how many people download tens of thousands of episodes? Well, it's 1%. It's a pretty small group, actually, are here. So here's where you have the Joe Rogans, the National Public Radio, and providers like that. In terms of if you're at the 50th percentile, so if you were so-called average, in the middle, that would be 162 downloads per episode. Well, that would be something to take a lot of pride in. Well, that's telling us then there's a lot of people that have a lot fewer number of downloads. And I think this is important to just kind of realize that don't set up false expectations for yourself that you're going to have tens of thousands of people are within a few months going to be downloading your podcast. That could happen, and it's all about the compelling content. But I think it's more important to think about you got a personal conversation with one other person, and then it builds from there. Why share each podcast episode widely? Well, it's real important that you find providers who can help get your podcast out there to a large number of people. And that's the reason why things like Spotify are so helpful, because there's a lot of people that already have Spotify on their cell phones. A lot of people already are paying for or listening to the free version of the streaming music from Spotify. So the thing that happens is that, and let's see if that comes up on the next slide here. The idea is that you create an episode. Then you're going to end up finding other places for you to share that podcast episode. You could end up sharing that through a Facebook page, Twitter, your LinkedIn page. Then you end up having podcast apps. And what happens is that people copy what Apple is providing for free through their service. And they automatically provide whatever the podcast is that's on the Apple homepage for podcasts. They go ahead and they provide it as well, even though you don't even know who they are. What I've learned is that there's at least 17 different places are sharing my podcasts through Apple, and I don't even have to do any work in order to be able to get that. That's the reason why it's really important that your podcast is made available through the Apple Store for podcasting. It's free. They don't charge anything, and anything that's provided through, well, I'll take that back. Up until the last year, you could always know that every single podcast was always free. Now you've got some licensing models that are being tested out by Apple and Spotify, but you're always going to be notified before that happens, so you don't have to worry about getting charged then. These are some of the big distributors in the United States for podcasts, and you probably already have some of these already pre-installed on your cell phones and maybe even on your desktop computers. And I'm not going to go through and read through all of these here, other than I'll just make a little plug for this one. This is the one that I use. It's called Libsyn. And the reason why I like Libsyn is that whenever I register with Libsyn, it makes it really easy for me to be able to distribute this to Facebook pages, to other podcast apps that are out there, to websites. It just makes things really easy. But as I said, Spotify is a big player in this, and it would be unfair not to be able to talk about them. And then you see all the other ones. This is just a limited number. This is what I call the major ones. My guess is that there's probably hundreds of them that are out there. As I said, if you have something that's listed on the Apple directory of podcasts, it's automatically going to be made available through all of these places. And I also ought to mention Blueberry is also another popular place that people will end up publishing their podcast through. There is a fee to be associated with that. As I said, things automatically get done for you. And I think that really helps to make things a lot easier then. Another place you want to go to maybe is to check out this website down here for Podcast 411. Rob Walsh has really been a big player in the field of podcasting for a long time. To be fair, he's also a vice president with Libsyn, but I think that he has a really good free information about different podcast apps. Now, once again, why is it important? I mean, maybe you're thinking, well, why not? I just listen to it through the Google podcast app, or I want to publish it through the Apple podcast app. Well, because some people don't like those apps. They like one of these. In fact, a real popular one is Overcast. A lot of people like that one. I could go through, and it all depends on personal taste. So that's the reason why it's important to make sure that your podcast is made available to the widest number of podcast apps, because people have their own personal choices on what they want to listen. As I said, you can end up posting these into web pages. So once again, for the purposes of this overview, I'm not going to be able to do this in a detailed way. I'm just simply going to suggest you Googling web pages, embedded podcast episodes, and you can be able to learn how to be able to do that. Once again, some people go to web pages, not as much anymore, but some people, that's their preference. Social media channels, as I shared with you, I end up having my podcast made available through Facebook, a YouTube channel, Twitter, personal LinkedIn account. I haven't started doing Instagram yet, but I've thought about it. And maybe you're thinking, I said, wait a minute, David, you were talking about having audio podcasts. How are you getting those onto YouTube? Well, with Libsyn and with some of the other services, what you do is that you set up an image, which would probably be the logo for your podcast, which is another requirement that you have to have a visual image of something to represent your podcast to have it listed on one of those podcast directories. Well, Libsyn and other ones, what they do is that they take that image plus your audio and they end up creating a video. And then that is what ends up being posted up onto the YouTube page, which you have set up through your own personal YouTube account then. Once again, I know that it seems like I'm really asking you to do a lot of extra work, I guess, but there's endless number of YouTube tutorials in order to be able to help you to do any of these things here. Where do I begin with my podcast? Well, the first thing is you got to develop your idea. Think about that. What I did is that the first thing that I did actually was I listened to podcasts for 6 months. And I started noticing what was the pattern. How did they organize them? You don't have to make these super sophisticated. You can just simply hit the record button, talk, hit the stop button, and then post that up to Spotify. It's really a simple process. You don't get to do as much sophistication. Now, there is a lot of cool things that you can do at Spotify, but I just simply want to get across the idea that it's important to listen, and I did that for 6 months and got ideas, and then you start developing your idea. Then you go and you record your very first episode, and then you share your episode with the world. Now, one of the harsh lessons that Rob Walsh and other leaders in the field will tell you is that you need to get started. Don't wait to be perfect. And your first 5 episodes that you're going to create, you are going to hate them after you get to episode number 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Why? Because there's a learning curve that you're going to go through. and it can be a harsh learning curve. How do you know how tough it is? Well, you end up looking at any of these podcast directories. I hang out in the iTunes podcast app, and I'll look at different podcasts I'm interested in, because you can use a search engine in order to find them. I like history podcasts, particularly World War II podcasts. The number of podcasts that you find that have only 1, 2, or 3 episodes, and that was it, and then they stopped. And you wonder, why was it they stopped? Well, number one, I want to give my propers to those people that only got 1, 2, or 3 done, because that's better than 0. But it's really hard. And sometimes you don't estimate how much time it's going to take and the effort and such. The expense is not the hardest part of podcasting. The biggest issue is time. And something that I suggest to other people, and that is, think about podcasting as your favorite hobby. This is not something that you can just do an hour a week. It just doesn't work that way. It's going to take more time, and you need to count the cost. But the most important thing that you got to do is you got to start over there with step 1. You got to develop your idea. Think about what it is that you want to do. Map out what the first 10, 15, or 20 episodes are going to be. You don't want to start off with the first podcast episode that, "Hi, I'm David Arundel. Glad that you tuned in. I'm looking forward to this podcast. I'm going to put it up once a week. It's going to be about the history of Minneapolis." That's where I'm located at. And that's all I'm going to say for today. And then you hit the stop button. Well, that's not a bad place to start. Maybe a 2-minute preview. But if I don't know already what episodes 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 are going to be, and if I don't devote the time that it's going to take in order to put together some notes, some people feel comfortable about just speaking. I'm a trained historian and a classroom teacher. Goodness knows, I'm not perfect. There's a lot of things I could do to make this YouTube video better, but I'm not speaking from a set of notes. But, there's a lot of podcasters that feel the need to go ahead and write a script for themselves. Well, that takes time. That makes a high-quality podcast. I think that is a noble thing to do, but the elements of time and your devotion are really going to be key. But it all goes back to, if you don't have a compelling reason to listen to the podcast, you've got 5 million other choices. And the question is, why are they going to select you to listen to? This is one of the ones that I do. It's peer-assisted learning groups. It's an academic one. I would recommend it to you only simply as an example. And you can see the web page that the podcasts are available. You can actually go to this web page and click on individual episodes. Oftentimes, those podcast apps that you publish your podcast through, well, they'll end up providing a web page for you to put your episodes, a little bit of space to describe what's going on inside the podcast, and then a link to listen to that particular episode. You don't have to download. You don't have to become a subscriber. You just simply go to the website. For me, that web page there, that's provided by Libsyn. So they make life easy for me. And their most inexpensive plan is about $7 a month. So yeah, there is some cost that I invest, but then again, think about all the other hobbies and how much money you spend on pizza, beer, soda, tickets to games, transportation costs. You just talk about all the rest of the stuff. Well, once again, what are you willing to budget for your hobby? I don't complain about people who buy season tickets to go to the Vikings football games here in Minneapolis. They've made a commitment to that. The good thing about podcasting is it's not going to cost you the price of a season tickets to go to the football game. In fact, it won't even cost you probably the cost to go to a single game. But that's for another discussion. So, what's your idea for a podcast? I would encourage you to stop the video at this point and think about that. There's some reason why you decided to start listening to this podcast about half an hour ago. I hope it's been useful, but we've got more to do. Recording hardware and software. Boy, this is the scary place. Because if you end up looking at the YouTube tutorials on what kind of computer, what kind of microphone should I have, everyone's got an opinion. And the microphones can range all the way up to quote-unquote broadcast quality, which would be the ones that they would use in television studios and professional video production, all the way down to simply using the microphone that's in your laptop computer, which could be, you could consider that as being free then. Well, let me just give you a couple of suggestions. It's always important to read the fine print about your apps for recording, your microphones, what the costs are. I just want to draw your attention down here to the bottom, down here. You can read all of the rest of the fine print here in this slide. I violate all the rules of PowerPoint in my presentation, but it is the way it is. My suggestion is that you get a USB microphone. It plugs right into your computer. You can get those for anywhere from $19 to $28. I would suggest that you don't use the microphone in your laptop computer because the quality is really not as good. Really popular ones are things like Snowball, the Blue Snowball. That's about $50. Once again, these were 2021 costs. I'm sure their costs more now. A really popular one you'll hear some podcasters talk about is the Blue Yeti. It's $130. And I'm using the Shure MV51, and it's $150. But you know what? If you're just starting off with podcasting, I suggest that you invest in the $19 to $28 USB plug-in to your laptop and have a headset. You may already have one. If you're a gamer, you probably already have a headset. I'd suggest that you get something that's probably at the gamer level. You know, you can spend $100, $200 on them that comes with a microphone built in, which would be nice to use for podcasting. But my suggestion is get some sort of an inexpensive headset that's maybe, $15 or so. Because you want to be able to hear what it is that you're saying through some better a headset. It'll give you a better feeling for what it is you're producing. One other tip with microphones is that the closer you are to the microphone, the better you sound. I'm about 6 inches from the microphone. I'm not claiming this is perfect, what I'm doing. I know that this Shure microphone makes me sound better than I deserve, and if I was a little bit more careful, I would be more close to the microphone. It kind of deepens the voice, gives a little more oomph to your message. But once again, don't think about you need to go out there and buy a $1,000 audio rig. It just isn't necessary. Maybe somewhere down the line you'll decide to do that. I didn't buy this $150 microphone at the beginning. I used something that was a lot less expensive at the beginning. Voice recording software. Well, there's all kinds of things that are out there for recording. Let me just point out a couple of them for you. One of them is Audacity. And you see the website address. The cool thing about Audacity is that it is free. and there are plenty of tutorials on YouTube to show you how to be able to use it. You also see the other ones there as well. What are some that work on the Mac only? Well, for me, I oftentimes end up using GarageBand. And it's free with a Mac OS operating system device. So I use that. But once again, a lot of people use Audacity. And then also you can record these on the web. And I talked about that a little bit earlier when I was talking about Spotify. Actually, the way that you do the podcast for Spotify is you end up using something that's called anchor.fm. So I'm just simply going to send you to the website there, and then you can do more searching on YouTube tutorials and such. But that's the way that you end up recording then. There are smartphone apps that you can record, and you can end up sending those files to yourself with an email attachment. That's okay too. There's no end to the different ways that you can do your recording for it. My suggestion is it's more important to do your first 5 episodes rather than wait for perfection. You can always buy new equipment and find new software later on. In terms of what are some of the big ones that are out there for doing recording, well, I just wanted to give you these 3 here. You might not, some of you may be familiar with Zoom, and you use it all the time. If you have children, they've probably been educated by Zoom for the past few years during the pandemic. Zoom actually gives you the ability to create an M4A file, audio file, along with the video. So actually, Zoom can permit you to be able to create an audio file that you could use for a podcast. As I said, one of the easiest ways to get into podcasting is through Anchor FM. Another one is called Vocaro.com. But I just wanted to give you some examples there. And then here's a couple of slides about each one of them. You can set up your account for free. You can use your computer microphone. It's pretty easy. Press new episode, press record, press save episode, and you're done. Once again, go to the YouTube videos in order to see more on the demos. There's another one that's out there. It's real popular among educators called Vocaro. Once again, it has a pretty simple set of instructions here, and it's another way in order to be able to create episodes. I'm going to go ahead, and if you want to read this more in depth, hit the pause button in order to see the detail here. And once again, all of the PowerPoint slides, they're all available through that website that I talked about. And then, as I said, for Zoom, it ends up creating an audio-only M4A file. Normally people see all of these other things with the actual recording of the video and such, like this bottom one down here, Zoom 0 MP4. Well, what we want is, if you want an audio, well, you already have that, and that's free software, perhaps for you, if you already own that software or a license to it anyway. For podcast hosting, well, once again, you get what you pay for. There are some services that are free, but the question is going to be, what are the limitations? You may want to just start off with something that's free. You can start off with Spotify/Anchor and then move your podcast somewhere else later on. I thought that's pretty generous of them to let you start off podcasting, and then you can actually take all your episodes and you can go to a different app then. But once again, these are all questions that you have to ask. And that's the reason why. Is there one perfect one that's out there? No. It is on how much work that it requires to use the system, what is its capability, and obviously what is the cost. And these are all different questions that are all down here. I've already shared with you my preference of using Libsyn. For me, it is simple to use, it's a reasonable cost, gives me maximum distribution. But, boy, the field continues to grow so much. And as I said, Spotify already owns 40% of the podcast market. When you say Spotify, you can also say Anchor. It's basically the same thing. So who am I to say that Spotify is not the very, very best place to start with? It's probably the simplest place to start. And getting started is a good thing. What are some of the popular hosting services in the United States, at least? Well, once again, hit the pause button on your video and you can see the websites for each one of them here. As I said, Blueberry's a really popular one. I've already said probably too much about Libsyn. Podbean's pretty popular. And then also SoundCloud's also really popular among some. Particularly SoundCloud's real popular for independent music artists as well, which is a real kind of a... whenever you talk about all of this, the independent music artists also are going to be operating in a lot of ways like the podcasters are. Once again, I was going to do a demo for you, but for purposes of this recording, I just simply wanted to say I think these are two really important ones to end up considering in terms of how to get started. As I say, Anchor's over here on this side, and it's totally free, but it has some limitations. One thing I need to warn you about Anchor, and that is they have this wonderful feature, and they go, you go and set up a podcast with us. Tell you what, would you like to have music, whatever music genre you want, anything that is available through the streaming service of having a senior moment here. Anything that is available through, David. We're just going to keep pushing through here. You know who I'm talking about. Their streaming music service. They're going to say, you can embed that into your podcast. Well, that's pretty cool, except if you want to do that, you have to be a dues-paying member for the streaming music service, and the only people who can listen to your podcast are also dues-paying subscribers to the streaming music. So, in a sense, you really kind of wall off your podcasts from the rest of the world. Now, there's a lot of people who listen and pay the monthly fee for the streaming music service. So for them, that's a great audience. I just like the flexibility that you get over here on this side, and these are all going to have some sort of a fee on a monthly basis that you're going to have to pay them. So once again, what is it you're going to see whenever you look at the menu for Anchor? Spotify. Goodness sakes. I'm 66 years old and I'm showing it. Sorry, guys. Well, it's about as simple as you can do. And I admire it, and I admire it enough. I actually have my own podcast is being hosted through Anchor. It's one on tech videos, and I'll probably end up posting an audio version of this podcast through my Anchor podcast because I'm trying to learn about it, and I want to be fair to people who I talk to. I mean, that's one of the things that I shared way up front is that I got to be honest. And you've got to know whether you can trust me on what I say, or else you would just hit the stop button and you'll move on to somebody else. So that's about as simple a menu as possible. You can have sound effects. That's what's inside of the library here. You can choose to integrate music in, but I already told you that if you end up doing that, everybody's got to be paying their money on a monthly basis to Spotify, which is a lot of my college students did. I just happened to do the streaming service through Apple, so I'm not here to compete with them. You can also share audio messages that people have sent to you. So that's pretty cool. So if you get, like, somebody sends in a 5 or 10 or 30-second comment about one of your podcast episodes, well, you actually can integrate that into your next episode then. And also you can have transition music. So you can either just do it really simple, where you just hit the record button, then you hit the stop button, and then you're done. Or you can do all of these. So think about these as a series of Legos that all stick together. And that's whenever you start making things more complicated, and also you start making this more of a hobby or a job, however you want to look at it, in terms of its sophistication. But you know what? The reason why people are going to be listening to your podcast, it's because of what you're doing here. It's your idea. It's your topic. It's you or the people who you interview. That's the reason why they're going to do that. This stuff here, this is wonderful. I call it the icing on the cake, and it is good. And I admire them for what they're doing. It's a brilliant model. In Turtlelipson, well, this is much too tiny to see, but it just simply shows you the menu of where I can send my podcast to. I can send it, these are all the other different apps that they automatically send it to. The most important one they send it to, obviously, is going to be Apple, because if they end up sending it to Apple, they're also automatically going to get picked up here. But I like this one in terms of the way I'm able to designate this to go to social media channels, to websites, in addition to other apps. Now, you can also create your voice from text-to-voice software. Some people, and maybe you've noticed this on YouTube, there's some YouTube videos that have kind of a mechanical voice to them. Well, I'm assuming that those people who are making those videos don't want to use their own voice. So instead, they end up using voice-to-text. Text-to-voice. They type out their podcast, and they end up feeding it through some software, and it ends up creating a mechanical voice. And those mechanical voices are getting much, much better. It's important that you've got to read the fine print. I say that all the time. And you've got to make sure that how is it that software that's going to take your text, read it, and then create a voice, well, what kind of things are they going to create? And they really need to be an MP3 or a WAV file, one of those two, probably preferably an MP3. That's the smallest audio file generally. See if the software permits you to use these. So you've got to make sure that the software permits you to use these for external use, for podcasting and YouTube. There's a lot of text-to-voice, which is just for your use. It's not authorized for you to use for a podcast episode or for it to appear on a YouTube episode. I wouldn't recommend that you push over and ignore the copyrights there, because there are people that are out there that use algorithms in order to find the use of their voices, their mechanical voices, and to see whether you actually have a permit to use those then. Once again, these are other questions for you whenever you're thinking about licensing some sort of software. Is there a perfect choice? No, because it all comes down to the quality of the audio voice and then what the cost is going to be. I happen to use one that's pretty expensive, and the quality of the voice is really good. In fact, they give you, we'll see an example here in just a second, they give me well over 100 voices in English. Here are the paid text-to-voice ones that are out there. The one that I use is Natural Reader. Now, I do a lot of text-to-voice, because I'm actually taking all of my previous publications and I'm converting them all over to audio files. And why am I doing that? Both to use for podcasting, and then I eventually want to be able to create my own audiobooks. That's another thing you have to check for. But there's other ones that are out there. Amazon, and then you see the second one, and VoiceStream there, and the final one. So there's lots of choices that are out there. Once again, you need to think about whether you really want to do that or not. If you want to see an example of a text-to-voice, well, this is mine. And here's the website that you can go to, and you can just click on one of the files, and you can decide. Now, I do something which some people think is kind of odd, except they find it kind of interesting, and that is I have a conversation among the voices. Now, hold on for a second. Let me try to explain that. Inside of an article, you always have little subheadings. You notice that in magazine articles or in the newspaper, if anyone reads a newspaper anymore, or whatever the news is you read online, you have all these little subheadings. What I did is that I used two different voices. I had the main narrator is reading my article, and then I took some of those subheadings and I turned them into questions. So I actually have a conversation going on among a male and a female about one of my articles. It actually turned out to be a lot easier to create the questions, and it made it a lot more engaging. And I actually have the voices talk to each other. I know that sounds totally mental, but listen to some examples and see whether you think that helps to make use of a computer voice more interesting to listen to. Nothing is worse than listening to something that's just monotone. That's the reason why it's tough doing this particular presentation for you. I'm trying to use some voice inflection, using pause, asking you to stop the video and to think about some of the questions. I'm scribbling on the screen. I'm doing whatever I can to kind of make this more interesting to listen to. Well, this is just simply one more example for you to consider. This is the one company that I work with, is Natural Reader, and it costs a lot. It costs $500+ a year. And for me, obviously, this is in the heavy hobby time whenever you go and you expend that. I don't exactly recommend that for everyone. I hope that you can get maybe someone else to sponsor for this. And obviously, I must not be putting children through college if I can afford to do something like this. But I've been doing this podcasting since 2005, so I've kind of ramped up a little bit. So I have some more disposable cash. I don't always suggest this for everyone, but I just want to plant this in the back of your mind. It's something you might want to consider. You can see over here, these are all the English voices, and then you see all the voices of other countries. Well, probably you're not going to be using the Swedish one unless you're in Sweden, and perhaps some people from Sweden might be listening to this YouTube. But I just want to give you some ideas about what you could do. And then here are some individual slides. I'm not going to take time to go through all of them. My suggestion is to either hit the pause button, read the PowerPoint slide, or go to the end of this video, look at the website address, and then actually go and look at the PowerPoint slides themselves. That's for Amazon. That's for this company. That's for Canty Voice. Here's a little more detail about Natural Reader. Here's a little more in detail about VoiceStream. And then there are free text-to-voice software. But like I said, if it is free, it is not, oops, go back here, it is not approved. Well, I'm not a cop. It's up to you. But there are other examples that are out there. And then the succeeding slides all give us the fine print about these. You'll also notice here's Natural Reader. They actually have a free version, but it is not going to allow you to record more than, I think it's like 1 or 2 pages of text. So it's limited in terms of what it permits. And then here are the fine print for each of these particular companies then. And if you want to read the fine print, hit the pause button, and then you can read the text. If not, I'm just going to keep moving forward. It's really quite remarkable. And frankly, you can just do a search either in YouTube or in Google for text to voice to see what are the new options that are out there. And new things are coming out all the time. It's really quite amazing. How can I create my own audiobook? Well, you got to read the fine print. And that is that some of the audiobook distributors do not accept synthetic voices. That's a computer voice. I call them synthetic voices. But they don't take those yet. So it is possible for you to be able to create. There's a couple of apps available through the Mac store for OS laptops and desktops. There are some software programs that will let you create an audiobook, and then you could post that to a website, and then somebody could click on that link to that audiobook, and it would automatically be downloaded to their cell phone or to their iPad, and then they could listen to the audiobook that way. But at the present time, that's an awful lot of work. At some point, one of the major publishers, and the two major publishers at this point, would end up being Amazon for Kindle, and it would be Apple for the Apple audio bookstore. One of those two is going to eventually come out and accept synthetic voices. And whenever that happens, then we're going to see an explosion of more audiobooks then. And here's the audiobook software that I was talking about, Audiobook Maker. I've been experimenting with that, Audiobook Creator. So at this point, one publisher's called Smashwords. It just got merged into a new company, and they claim that they have the opportunity for you to be able to create audiobooks. I think I would really read the fine print a lot more because they're still kind of in process for what they're up to. But if you just want to experiment with this, it really is kind of fun. You can have your audiobook to have chapters to it. And as I said, I can create these for my own personal use. I just don't have the ability to submit these to any of the major audio bookstores at this point. Wow, you've stuck with me for a long time on this video. What is the next steps? Well, the first place is to do what I did. Listen to podcasts with a critical ear. Learn how to do podcasting. And probably the best place to do this is through YouTube, and is not buying all of the podcast books that are published. I'm sure there's a couple of them. I think the one that I think is probably the most helpful, it has a horrible title, but it's the Idiot's Guide to Podcasting. And that's part of the whole series of the Idiot's Guides to, and they've got probably 100 or 200 different books on different topics. It's really pretty good, but most of the books really are not as helpful. Experiment. Give yourself permission to experiment and just keep going. It's going to get better. Give yourself permission to go through the learning curve. it's worth it. As long as you see that this is going to become an important hobby in your life, and it's one that's kind of a individualistic one, that maybe it's not really one that's really all that open to sharing with the family, even though there are some families that actually do podcasting together. I've listened to one. It was a father and son, and it was really quite entertaining listening to them in their podcast. Something else I didn't mention about an hour ago. What's the perfect length for a podcast? It's 10 to 15 minutes. 5 minutes is okay too if you have a very specific topic and a very specific thing you're communicating. These things do not have to be hour-long things. And in fact, it's probably going to be more likely to be listened to if it's in this 5 or 10 or 15-minute variety versus something that is really super long. People just don't tend to want to focus that long. I mean, that's not being critical about people. It's just the way people are. And probably thinking about keeping it simple, keeping it short, is probably going to be a good way to move forward. Suggested next steps. I'll just simply refer back to these slides here and just suggest that you use the pause button in order to look at the detail. Excuse me for messing that up. Here's the detail about listening to podcasts, then beginning to learn how to do podcasting. Something here, in case you're an educator, one of the very best things that you can do is to get your students involved in your class. Your students will be so impressed that you are doing podcasting or thinking about it, and you could create some, let's go back there, some unpaid assistantships. I'm not talking about exploiting your students, not at all. It's just that chances are you don't have money to hand out to pay your students to help create the podcast. But for them, they could be able to put that onto their resume. And that would be pretty impressive for them to be able to list that I helped to co-produce or co-edit the podcast, whatever the name is associated with your course. That would be pretty impressive. And also, students are really smart. They're good at the technology. They have to deal with the learning curves just like we do, getting them involved. Okay. Beginning to experiment. It's really nice if you can find a partner, somebody else. It could be student assistants. It could be some other faculty members where you teach at. It could be other people in the community who share the same common interests that you have. Maybe you end up going to clubs or occasional meetings with others and you talk about these topics. Be around another person. But remember, content is king. It's the value of what is being talked about. It's not the manner in which it is presented. And that was one of the biggest mistakes. I waited an extra year before I got started with podcasting because I thought somehow I had to be perfect. Well, obviously, if you've stuck with me for this hour, you know how imperfect I am. But for some reason, you've decided to listen to this video all the way to this point. I'm going to assume it's because of this up here, is that there was something valuable that you were learning from this process. And that's the exact same thing that's true with podcasting. Keep going, it gets better. Remember, the value of the content, not the production values, is going to attract your audience. People will come. And then what's one or two action steps that you're going to implement because of today? Is it that you're going to start listening to more podcasts? That you're going to listen to podcasts about podcasting? Those are all over the place. And you can search for those and find those through the Google or the Apple podcast stores, which they're all free. Obviously, we can go to Google and we can end up going to YouTube. So we can do a lot of learning. So that's something. We can identify an idea. What is the idea? Who's a partner that we could find that shares with us the passion as well as the idea? Maybe one of you is the tech person and one of you is the content person. That might end up making a really good working team then. So once again, what is it that you're going to do because you've listened to all of this? Just some summary thoughts in case you're interested in examples of the media that I've created. Well, go to davidmedia.org and you can see my podcasts, YouTube channels, Facebook pages, Twitter accounts, Animoto music videos, LinkedIn pages. The things that happened is that the podcast, they end up getting fed into the YouTube channel. I end up having a Facebook page for each one of my podcasts. I end up shooting them out through Twitter. I don't use it for the Animoto. And also, I post them to my LinkedIn account. So there's a real relationship. It's a real ecosystem, if you could call it that way. And once again, why is it that we end up having all these different places to distribute? Some people live in the world of Facebook, and they're only going to listen to your podcast because you've posted a new one up on your Facebook page, and they've gone to your page and liked it, and by some miracle, which I don't understand, you end up getting a notice about a new thing has just been posted up. So some people live in the Facebook world, some people do it through YouTube, some people actually follow other people through Twitter, and the rest. And some of us are LinkedIn account network people. So once again, there's so many different places for people to be able to listen. I've already given you a couple of podcasts that you might want to listen to, but goodness, there's 5 million of them that are out there. And then here's that page. If you stuck with me all the way to the end, here is the website to go to. So hit the pause button in order to be able to write that down and then go there, because everything that I talked about, including the PowerPoint slides, they're all available here. If you want to communicate with me, you can call me on the phone. The insurance people certainly call me 3 times a day. I'd much rather have a conversation with you than somebody who's trying to sell me an Advantage Medicare Gap insurance plan. I would really enjoy a conversation. There's my email address up there. Here's my personal website. And also I have a section of my website that's devoted just to all of these resources about podcasting. And a lot of the items that are here, they're also located up there. So those should be really similar to each other. Wow. Thank you for listening. It's been a long presentation. Probably could have broken this up into different pieces, but I did what I did. So let's keep up the conversation with each other. Take good care. Thank you for listening today. And let's keep up the conversation, as I said. Bye-bye.